Ever imagine what it was like for university students worldwide when COVID hit? I mean, we're talking the very first wave, total upheaval of everything. Today, we are diving into this massive global research study with insights from over 30,000 students. Get ready for some serious perspective.
Absolutely. We're talking 62 countries all grappling with this sudden shift to online learning.
Yeah.
This deep dive is going to unpack not just the shared struggles, but also how the experience varied drastically based on where students were in the world.
I have to say, I was floored by this first stat. Picture this: 86.7% of students globally had their in person classes canceled.
Wow.
That's basic. You're talking about a near universal experience of disruption. Can you imagine that kind of shift in your academic life?
It really makes you appreciate the sheer scale of the pandemic's impact. We're not talking about a snow day here, right?
Right.
This was months of universities physically closing, forcing everyone to adapt essentially overnight.
Yeah, and adapt they did, although the study shows it wasn't always smooth sailing, especially when it came to technology. So let's talk tech. What online learning methods did students actually enjoy using?
Well, we all remember those early days of Zoom calls, right?
Oh, yeah.
Turns out real-time video conferencing came out on top.
Interesting.
Students appreciated that live interaction, even if it wasn't the same as being in a lecture hall.
Yeah, yeah.
There's something about seeing your classmates and being able to ask questions that just makes a difference.
Makes total sense. It beats staring at lecture slides in your pajamas. Speaking of which, were there any methods that students were not keen on?
Definitely. While sending presentations was popular because it was flexible, audio recordings were the least favorite.
Hmm.
Turns out, listening to a lecture without that visual component was basically a recipe for a nap for many.
Yeah, I can see that. And this is where it gets even more fascinating. The study found that satisfaction with online learning wasn't just about the tech itself, but varied greatly by continent. Any guesses as to why?
Well, I mean, think about it. Access to reliable internet and technology is crucial, right?
Right.
Students in Oceania, North America, and Europe regions with really robust digital infrastructure were generally more satisfied. But it's not as simple as just having a laptop and a connection.
Right. You need the actual skills to navigate this new world of online learning. What did this study reveal about that?
It's surprising. It wasn't the basics like just browsing or email that tripped students up. It was the advanced software settings that really impacted their confidence. Imagine having to adjust your privacy settings, in the middle of presenting a group project.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
That's the kind of tech anxiety some students faced.
That's a great point. It's easy to assume that everybody's comfortable with that stuff, but it's a whole other ball game when you're kind of thrown into the deep end. And then on top of that, you're also shifting to online learning, which requires a whole other level of self-discipline and focus.
Absolutely. You're no longer in a designated learning environment,
Right.
which can be a real challenge for concentration and motivation.
Especially with, Netflix calling your name from the other room. Speaking of challenges, let's dive into the workload debate. The study found that how students perceived their workload after going online varied drastically by continent.
Absolutely. Students in Oceania, Europe, and North America often felt their workload had actually increased,
Oh, wow.
perhaps because they were used to more face-to-face support,
Interesting.
and replicating that online might have actually felt like more work.
That's fascinating. So it's like they were trying to recreate that classroom structure online, which could be really demanding. But then you have students in South America, Asia, and Africa who
Yeah.
actually reported a decrease in workload. What's the story there? Because it's hard to imagine online learning being easier.
Right, and it's important to remember this isn't about some continents having it easy while others struggled.
Mm.
This difference likely goes back to those disparities in access and infrastructure we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Think about it. If you're constantly battling like spotty internet or lacking the right technology, engaging with online learning at the same level just isn't possible.
Yeah, it paints a really complex picture of what workload actually means in this context.
Definitely.
It's not just about the volume of assignments, it's about having the tools and support to even begin to tackle them.
Exactly. And on top of that, you have students adjusting to completely new learning environments at home, managing their time differently, dealing with the emotional weight of a global pandemic.
Right.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. Speaking of which, let's shift gears to the social and emotional side of things. Uni life is about so much more than just academics.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine how isolating it must felt to lose that sense of community. Who were students turning to for support during those early days of the pandemic?
Well, it might not surprise you that close family members top the list.
Yeah.
Over half of students globally were connecting with family online at least once a day, especially in Asia and Europe.
Interesting.
It makes sense when uncertainty hits, we often turn to our closest bonds for support.
It makes you wonder, for those who moved back home, if those daily chats were a source of comfort or maybe a bit of added stress in close quarters. But I imagine just having that familiar connection was super crucial. What about friends?
Close friends were right up there, especially for students in Europe and Oceania. It really highlights how vital those peer relationships are, even if it's just seeing a friendly face through a screen.
There's something so comforting about connecting with people who just get the whole student experience.
Yeah.
But what about the other end of the spectrum? Were there any groups students were less likely to reach out to?
Interestingly, administrative staff at universities and voluntary organizations were kind of at the bottom of the list.
Huh.
Now, this isn't to say that these groups weren't offering support, but it highlights a potential gap in awareness or accessibility.
That's such an important point, right?
Yeah.
It's not enough to just have resources available. Students need to know where to find them and feel comfortable reaching out. It makes you wonder, were there any differences in how these support systems played out across continents?
Absolutely.
Right.
Remember how we talked about students in Oceania and North America often living with roommates or friends?
Yeah.
Well, they were also more likely to be connecting with their housemates online daily,
Okay.
suggesting kind of a strong support network within their living situations.
So even with social distancing, those close-knit living arrangements provided a sense of community. It really highlights how important it is to consider the whole picture of a student's life, not just their academic experience.
Exactly. And let's not forget the emotional roller coaster that was those early months of the pandemic.
Oh, right.
The study found some really interesting variations in how students coped with the emotional upheaval, particularly when we compare continents.
Okay, let's dive into that. Were there any continents where anxiety seemed particularly high? Because I imagine the uncertainty of that time weighed really heavily on everyone.
It really did. The study revealed that South America had the highest levels of anxiety reported, followed closely by Oceania.
Wow.
And it's not a coincidence that these regions were also at the start of their academic year when the pandemic hit.
Wow, that timing adds a whole other layer of pressure.
Sure.
Starting a brand new academic year amidst a global pandemic, I can see why anxiety levels would be through the roof.
Absolutely. Imagine the uncertainty of not knowing what your courses would look like, if you'd be able to connect with classmates, or even if you'd be able to stay in your university accommodation.
Right. And it wasn't just anxiety. Frustration was also a major emotion for students in South America and Oceania, right?
Mhm.
What were they most frustrated about? Was it the shift online or the lack of social interaction or something else entirely?
It was likely a combination of factors, but one key driver was this abrupt disruption of their academic plans and their social lives.
Right.
Remember, many students thrive on the structure and routine of university life.
Yeah.
The pandemic just threw all that out the window.
It's like having the rug pulled out from under you just as you're getting settled into a new year. But even amidst all this turmoil, there were glimmers of hope, right? Didn't the study find that North American students reported the highest levels of joy? What was going on there?
That's what's so fascinating about this research. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, human resilience shines through. While the study doesn't pinpoint the exact reasons for the higher joy levels in North America, it's worth considering if factors like strong social support networks, access to mental health resources, or even just cultural attitudes towards optimism played a role.
It makes you think about the interplay of individual resilience and the cultural context we're all navigating within. Like, it's not just about how you respond to a crisis. It's also about the support systems and cultural norms that shape your experience.
Precisely. And speaking of navigating challenges, let's talk about the anxiety students faced about their futures. Unsurprisingly, the pandemic brought a lot of uncertainty to the forefront, particularly when it came to careers and finances.
It makes you wonder if some of these anxieties were already simmering beneath the surface and the pandemic just amplified them.
Yeah.
After all, even pre-COVID, students were graduating into a rapidly changing job market with tons of student debt.
That's a really insightful point. The pandemic might have acted as a magnifying glass on existing societal anxieties, but it also introduced entirely new concerns.
Yeah.
The study found that students were deeply worried about, their future professional career prospects and how to navigate study-related issues in this new normal.
Those are some heavy things to grapple with, especially when you're still in the midst of your academic journey.
Yeah.
It's like the pandemic forced students to confront these big existential questions about their place in the world.
And those questions weren't just theoretical, right? They
Absolutely.
had tangible consequences for students' well-being.
Yeah.
The study found a strong link between financial security and overall mental health.
Makes sense.
Students who were worried about covering their tuition or who had lost their part-time jobs were understandably more stressed and anxious.
It really underscores how interconnected our financial, mental, and emotional well-being truly are.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just address one without considering the others. Did these financial concerns vary by continent as well?
They did. Remember how South America had the highest levels of anxiety?
Yeah.
Well, they also reported the highest levels of concern across a range of issues, from future education and career prospects to their personal mental health. It suggests that the pandemic's impact wasn't distributed equally, and existing inequalities likely played a role in shaping students' experiences.
That makes sense. If you're already living in a context with economic or political instability, the added pressure of a global pandemic could feel overwhelming.
Exactly. The pandemic was a global event, but its impact was felt very differently depending on where you were in the world and your own personal circumstances.
Right.
It's like this global crisis collided with our own individual realities, creating a unique set of challenges for everyone.
And those challenges weren't just limited to students' personal lives. They also extended to their perceptions of how institutions were handling this crisis.
Right.
The study asked students to rate their satisfaction with how various groups responded to the pandemic, from governments and universities to banks and hospitals.
Interesting.
I'm curious to see how those ratings played out.
Well, some of the findings might surprise you.
Okay, spill the tea. Which institution earned the highest marks from students?
My money's not on the banks.
You'd be right about that. Globally, hospitals came out on top.
It seems witnessing healthcare workers on the front lines, facing the pandemic head on, really resonated with students.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Seeing that level of courage and selflessness in action can be incredibly inspiring. Did any other institution score high marks?
Universities actually came in a respectable second place.
Oh.
Students generally appreciated their efforts to adapt to online learning and provide support during, a very chaotic time.
Although I'm guessing those satisfaction levels weren't exactly uniform across the globe.
Mhm.
Did the study break it down by continent at all?
You know it. Oceania, North America, and Europe showed the highest levels of satisfaction with their universities, while Africa lagged behind,
Yeah.
likely reflecting those persistent disparities in access to resources and technology we keep encountering.
Yeah, it's tough to feel good about online learning when you don't have the basic tools to participate. So, if hospitals were the heroes of this story, who ended up at the bottom of the class?
Well, this probably won't shock you, but governments and banks received the lowest satisfaction ratings from students worldwide.
Not exactly a surprise there. It seems like those institutions have some work to do to earn back public trust. Was there anything in the study that shed light on why students might feel this way?
While the study doesn't delve into the specific reasons, it does highlight the importance of clear communication and tangible support during times of crisis. Students need to know that those in power have their backs.
It's a powerful reminder that trust isn't just about policies and pronouncements. It's about actions and empathy.
Exactly. And that's something to keep in mind as we reflect on the lessons learned from this pandemic. It wasn't just a global health crisis, right?
Yeah.
It was a societal stress test.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from canceled classes and tech challenges to social isolation and the emotional roller coaster that came with it. As we wrap up here, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners will hold on to?
I think what's really striking is that this study captures just a snapshot in time,
Right.
those first few months of the pandemic.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, how have students' experiences and perceptions evolved since then?
It's a question we should all be asking ourselves. We've been through so much. Multiple waves, vaccine rollouts, ongoing economic uncertainty. Students have had to adapt and readjust at every turn.
And that's something I'll leave you with today. How do you think students' priorities, concerns, and hopes have shifted? What lessons have we learned? And how can we better support students, not just during pandemics, but in the face of any future challenges? Food for thought.
Lots to ponder. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deeper.